The Creature Files, presented by the Department of Mythical Wildlife, with your hosts, author Todd Calgi Gallicano, Christopher McClary at the Sightings Desk, and resident skeptic Fouke Afsahi. So sit back and listen as we report the latest news and up-to-date information about the mythical creatures living among us. The Creature Files. It might just save your life.
Hey everyone, and welcome to The Creature Files, the show that's all about mythical creatures, and that includes cryptids as well as creatures from folklore, anything that might be lurking in the woods, in the waters, or in the skies above. I'm your host, Todd Calgi Gallicano, the author of the Sam Lennon Adventure Series from the files of the Department of Mythical Wildlife, and you can learn more about the series online at mythicalwildlife.com. Now it's time to say hello to my co-hosts, Chris McClary at the Sightings Desk, and our resident not-so-skeptic, Fouke Afsahi. Hey guys.
Hey,
Hi.
Good to see you guys.
Okay, on to my background. As many of you know, every book in the Sam Lennon Adventure Series features a few of our national parks. And to honor that on the podcast, my background will always be a national park. Any guesses on what's behind me today, guys?
I don't recognize it.
It looks like Death Valley to me.
That is correct, Vic. Vic's just slaughtering you, McClary, with the national park guesses. But I also had the shirt on, so I don't know if that helped.
Cheating. Nice, Vic.
It is Death Valley National Park, and it's one of the parks that features pretty heavily in the Sam Lennon Adventure Series. There's a pivotal moment that happens in Guardians of the Griffin's Claw in Death Valley. Now, it is the hottest, driest, and lowest national park. Per the website, it is truly a land of extremes. Towering peaks are frosted with winter snow. Rare rainstorms bring vast fields of wildflowers. Lush oases harbor tiny fish and refuge for wildlife and humans. Now, the name might seem a little morbid, but it comes from the story of the pioneers who attempted to trek across the valley to California during the 1849 gold rush. Not everyone made it, but today, Death Valley is a pretty extraordinary place to visit. There are 3 million acres of wilderness and hundreds of miles of backcountry roads. The park contains an amazing variety of terrain, historic sites, plants, and animals for outdoor adventurers to explore. There's hiking, backpacking, camping, biking. It's a designated dark sky site. You can even tour locations in the park where Star Wars was filmed. So it's definitely one to put on the list to check out. Okay, let's get on with the show with our Sightings Desk. Chris, anything sighted out there?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there was a sighting down under in Australia. There is we have photographic evidence of the beast in Lake Barrington, and this photo was taken by tourists. And what was I guess what really startled everyone was it was near the beginning of this race called Rowing Tasmania, and they were worried about safety concerns because apparently some rowers were even complaining about some unusual movement in the water. So naturally, they've got a concern about whether or not they should even host the races right now. Something tells me this is a bit of a Loch Ness monster down under kind of a phenomenon.
Yeah, I did see that article. Interesting. And we'll, for those of you that are watching, you'll see the photo up. And those of you listening, we'll put the photo up on the story notes page at mythicalwildlife.com. So you can check it out there. Vic, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, once again, we've got a very blurry photo taken from very far away that shows maybe a lizard-like creature. Really hard to say. I probably wouldn't put any viewing platforms in just yet. You're going to have a lot of bored people, I think.
Well, it does certainly seem that there's a lot of lake monsters out there. I mean, we've covered several of them, and they keep sort of popping up. So, and then we would get these photos that are not necessarily conclusive evidence. So perhaps we need to speak with our mermaid friend and have her do some investigation underwater to see if these creatures are actually there. But hopefully we'll get some better photos. Okay, now on to the creature feature, but we're going to do things a little differently this episode. We talk a lot about legendary creatures on the Creature Files, but our guest is legendary in the world of cryptozoology. So this episode isn't about just one legendary creature or cryptid. It's about cryptid hunting, and we're going to talk to an expert in the field. So first, let's talk about cryptozoology. Cryptozoology is the study and search for animals which have not been formally described, often called cryptids, mystery beasts, or simply unknown animals. The study is carried out by people termed cryptozoologists. Some refer to it as monster hunting, and here we talk about cryptids as well as creatures from mythology and folklore. But often what we consider mythical is also a cryptid. Now, if you've ever dreamt of going into this field of study, you tuned into the right episode. We have one of the most accomplished monster hunters in the world on the show today, the legendary Lyle Blackburn. I don't even know where to begin with his biography. He's an acclaimed author, a filmmaker, a renowned cryptid investigator, and a musician who fronts the band Ghoultown. He's the narrator and producer of documentary films such as The Mothman of Point Pleasant and Boggy Creek Monster, as well as many others. You can find all that information online at lyleblackburn.com. He is a frequent guest on radio programs such as Coast to Coast AM and has been featured on television shows airing on Animal Planet, Destination America, Travel, Discovery Science, and Shudder. In his work with Monsters and Mysteries in America, he served as both consulting producer and a special episode host. As a musician, Lyle has achieved similar success. His band Ghoultown has released 8 albums, which have not only earned a loyal worldwide following, but found their way into movies, video games, and numerous live venues across the United States, Canada, and Europe. When Lyle isn't writing books, hunting monsters, or performing with his band, he can be found speaking at various cryptozoology conferences and appearing at horror conventions around the United States. All right, without further ado, let's bring on Lyle Blackburn. So it is with great honor and excitement that we welcome Lyle Blackburn onto the show. His latest book is Boggy Creek Casebook, Fouke Monster Encounters 1908 to the Present. It's an incredibly comprehensive accounting of the sightings of the Fouke Monster. It's pretty extraordinary stuff. You definitely want to check it out. Thanks, Lyle, so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So I'm just going to jump right in, as I like to do. And one of the first questions I like to ask every guest is sort of how you got involved in cryptozoology or in hunting cryptids. So what was the moment or moments that sort of brought you into this world?
Well, some of it was just early on with the things I was interested in as a kid. From as far back as I can remember, I always loved monster movies, and I saw Frankenstein movies and things, Wolfman. And at some point, I saw the Patterson-Gimlin film, the famous Bigfoot film, and I also got a book in elementary school that had stories of Bigfoot, Yeti, Loch Ness Monster. And when I read those, I thought, wow, this is really cool, because this sounds like, quote unquote monsters, but in real life, something you might can see, not Hollywood. And so from then on, I just loved the subject, and I loved the mystery of it, something that was unsolved and, something that you could be involved in with real life. Within that time frame, I saw a movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek in a drive-in, and that kind of brought it closer to home, because I was born in Fort Worth, Texas, and lived in the Texas area my whole life. And, of course, Bigfoot mostly early on was Pacific Northwest, and Loch Ness Monster was, Scotland. It was also far away. But Legend of Boggy Creek dramatized sightings of this creature called the Fouke Monster. And that was about 3.5 hours from where I lived. So, that was really scary and spooky. And basically, fast forward, I just kind of studied those subjects on the side. I became a musician and was doing writing and music my whole life. And at some point, I really wanted to write a book. And I thought, what's my favorite subject? What would I want to write about? And the Boggy Creek subject came up. So when I kind of got into this, it was just simply for almost my own interest. I wanted to find out the true story behind that. I wanted to write a book. And, something that was scary and spooky, and something that had mystery. And so once I wrote the book, it was well received and sold well, and realized that so many people were fans of Legend of Boggy Creek and the Bigfoot subject itself, all these years later. And then that's when I kind of, I guess, got into cryptids and cryptozoology, because I expanded from there.
So when you decided to do that, when you had this sort of notion to write this book and make it about the Boggy Creek Monster, where do you begin on something like that? Where do you, if you had, I mean, you hadn't written anything prior to that in terms of a book or done this kind of research. So for someone out there that's listening to this and going, well, where do you start? You know, where do you begin?
Yeah, I mean, it was somewhat daunting because, it just seemed like a big subject, and I kind of found some Bigfoot groups that were in the Texas area, and I went to a Bigfoot conference and, kind of just started getting up to speed on modern Bigfoot, technology, what they're using, what the history of sightings were. I mean, I generally knew, but not like in detail. I just really started going into it. And then, having picked the Boggy Creek subject, I looked around on the internet for newspaper clippings because, it's based on true stories, and there was articles in the 70s. I found a few of them, but obviously it was a subject I could investigate personally because, I just drove up to the town of Fouke, started asking around. I just went to some of the stores on the main strip. It's a really small town, and just kind of bumbled my way into a few people that were willing to talk. And I went to the Texarkana Gazette newspaper and got all the like the microfiche, and looked through all the newspaper articles and just started collecting all the data on, sort of the history, and then talking to people that, which I didn't realize at the time, had seen the creature, in more recent years. So I just kept going back to the town, and they couldn't get rid of me. And, eventually I pieced together and wrote the book.
Wow. That's wild. I mean, just the impetus to do that, and like starting from nothing in a sense is pretty incredible. It's especially, just when you're investigating something like you're doing like a journalist, where you're looking at all the information that's there, and no one else has done it is wild. So I guess the question would be, when you do sort of start to research a creature. Now you've written about several creatures, and now, like with Boggy Creek Monster or Lizard Man, or Momo, or whichever it is, what do you think is sort of the first step? So like if you're an aspiring cryptid hunter, and you want to write a book about a particular cryptid, or sort of, where do you think that is the best first step, the place where you begin?
I think the first is, like an investigative journalist, which, I kind of consider myself basically that, more Indiana.
I would say so. Yeah.
More Indiana Jones to it, but you got to start in a scholarly way. So if you're looking at a cryptid, in whatever area, you want to obviously start with trying to find out the history of sightings. How far do they go back? How credible do they seem? Look at those people who have seen things in the past, and then you want to go to the place where it's being cited. If possible. I mean, in my books, that once I established that criteria of, Blackburn goes there. I didn't just talk to the people. I went in the woods and the swamp and the bayous where it was reported, so that I could get a sense of, the reality and the possibility of the creature. So once you kind of have the data, whether it's newspaper articles or people posting sightings on the internet, then you go to the place, you talk to people there, you look around, you look at the woods, you say, is this even a place where, if it's a big animal or a Bigfoot, could it even viably live here? And if you say, well, yeah, there's all this backwoods out there, miles and miles, you go, okay, well, this might be possible. Then of course you're going to want to Indiana Jones and go into those places and, just see what you can see for yourself. And then you have the perspective of what people, that have seen the creature have as well, because you've been to the area. And then usually when you do something like that and you can piece that together, and especially if you can write a book, then or just a blog. You might post a detailed thing, say, here's what I found out about this cryptid. A lot of times people start contacting you and say, oh man, my grandfather saw this, or I saw this. And suddenly you start getting more once people see that you've done some good research and put it out there in some form or fashion. Things start coming to you, and then it becomes easier. So you can quickly become an expert on, say it's a cryptid in your hometown. Suddenly you're like the expert because you've really delved into it.
That's great. And there's something you mentioned where you said sort of Indiana Jones it, and sort of the way I consider you as sort of the rock star Indiana Jones of cryptid hunting. And because you're going out there into the woods, you're checking things out. And would you say that is maybe the most important aspect of sort of hunting or researching cryptids, to go to the places they were seen and get a feel for the environment where they were sighted?
I think it really is. And I mean, I think if you really start reading stuff, you can quickly suss out the ones where people are putting together Wikipedia style books or just, sightings and stuff. And that's great. And it's great to document that. But when you can bring people to that area and the area, it makes a better, if you're writing about this or you're putting out data, when you say I went there, and then again, not only that, it's like when you go there, that's when you meet people who you're not going to find on the internet, and people's whose stories were never out there. Because I mean, a lot of the ones I found were not in the newspapers. They were not logged onto BFRO database. They were just people I happened to find because I was there. So that's always the best method to find, all of the sightings and stories.
And that's something that's really a great aspect of what you do specifically, is getting these eyewitness accounts that no one knows about because people are afraid to talk about it. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that and the stigma that comes from sighting one of these creatures. We don't even know how many people have actually had experiences witnessing these creatures because a lot of them are afraid to come forward and talk about it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, like how you confront that aspect of these kinds of encounters where people don't want to talk about it. There's this stigma, and it's preventing them. And in some ways, it's preventing our understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, that's a good point, because, I'm just at a wild guess, I'd say maybe 1 out of every 10 are even reported. Maybe 1 out of every 15 are even reported in some way. Most of those just, they exist among a small circle of family or friends. So if you're trying to get those people to talk, obviously one thing I always do is I try to come across as well balanced in the way I'm looking at it. I don't go in with the belief that, oh man, we're trying to prove this is totally real. I'm just looking into it, and I can identify with people who are skeptical because people are. And then I can identify with people who said, dude, I saw this thing. And you got to have a well-balanced and come across, very like a journalist, like, hey, I'm just looking into this, and we'll decide later, but the stories are important. And then when you interview people, you got to reassure them that, look, you're not the only one who's seen something like this, and you're not crazy. You may seem wild, but in reality, there's so many people that have reported unexplained things, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you just saw what you saw, and people are then more willing. And of course, always give them the option if I write about it or if it's in a book, they can be anonymous. But most people just say, hey, you can use my name. They feel like I'm not going to make light of their story or write it up in a crazy way. It's just, this is the facts.
Mm-hmm. And so you've spoken to a lot of people in different areas of the country that have seen and witnessed these kinds of things. And, there are a lot of skeptics out there. And I because you've had so much experience in this world, I'm so curious as to, like, from your perspective, what account or accounts would you point a skeptic to and say, look at this, this was incredibly credible, and incredibly powerful in terms of the account of it. Are there any particular ones that stand out for you?
Yeah, certainly there's a number of them, which even for me are the ones that really keep me fired up and going, because, after so many sightings have been reported, where's the golden egg here, but the ones it's hard to convince people with anecdotal stories, just, stories. There's no physical facts to it. So if you have one, and there's one I point to in regards to Bigfoot in the South, and that's one that has some evidence to it. And it comes from this place called Elkins Creek, Georgia, in which a footprint was cast by a deputy police officer out there back in the 90s. And so those are great ones because you can show the cast and it looks full on like a Bigfoot cast. It's one of the biggest. It's about 18 inches long. It's just huge. And the story behind it, which I've personally interviewed this deputy, and at the time an older couple was reporting something coming around their property, and they lived in this rural area along Elkins Creek. In Georgia, it's heavily wooded, and there's a history of sightings of Bigfoot creatures. And he went out there, looked around several times, and by the time he drives out there, whatever it was gone. So he went out there one afternoon during the day on his own personal time and looked around more in detail, and he ended up going down to this creek where he just happened to see it was about 3 footprints, and they were coming up out of the water and then went up onto the leaves. But he just, the hair stood up on the back of his neck. He's looking at this huge track, and he had some plaster of Paris in the truck and went out and actually cast this thing. And long story short, it just sort of was put away into his closet. And then he met some guys who was interested in Bigfoot, and they ended up, he's like, well, I got this cast, and then it became like one of the best Bigfoot tracks to suggest that there's something behind these sightings. That's one of my favorite, because you've got some physical evidence, you've got the credibility of a police officer, you've got the typical story of somebody reporting something coming around their home in a rural area. I've even been to Elkins Creek. I looked at it myself. I was out in Georgia, and I drove down there one day just to check out the creek. And there's those, and then there's other ones I think are good ones where you can corroborate somebody's story. If you can tell a story of one eyewitness that says, I saw this thing, it crossed over in this creek and it walked off in the woods. Well, if somehow or another, maybe somebody else reported it who didn't know that guy, and those either got in the newspaper, or you yourself find all these interviews and go, well, dude, another guy just told me the same thing. Well, they weren't even aware of that. So if you can get some of that cross, verification between sightings, those are really good ones too. And I've had several of those where all of a sudden you realize there's some pattern to this between people that don't know each other. And those give you the, impression that, well, they saw something, they simply did.
I'm guessing that's like the really exciting moment for someone that's investigating this, when you start to see things sort of come together and get corroboration.
Absolutely. Yeah. You those are really exciting moments, when you realize, especially if you're the one that's brought the dots to connect, it's like, then all your time and effort becomes worth it. And then, and it also fuels your own passion to keep going forward to document this.
So, we've covered several creatures on the show, and we get a lot of perspectives as to sort of where they may come from, what's what is it about them, why do they appear? And we were talking about Mothman in the last episode, and we had Steve Ward on, and he has this sort of talks a lot about the sort of high strangeness factor, the bizarre sort of goings on around these creatures. Are they real, or are we seeing what we're meant to see? Some people call it interdimensional. We had one guest on, he called it the woo woo. He didn't like talking about that, but what is your theory on these things?
Well, it kind of varies depending on the creature, and like Steve's saying about Mothman, there's so many stranger aspects to that than just simply a cryptid or an animal. So you have to look at that with a broader theory, I think. For me, something like Bigfoot or the Fouke monster, I still operate under the ground level theory that it's some sort of a species of ape that is miraculously evaded discovery for this time. And there's a lot of Bigfoot sightings and stories all over the US and all over the world, and presumably they would be there's not a lot of species, but just enough to explain the variations across the different locations. Lake monsters. I mean, certainly when you start talking about water, it's much harder to say there is or there isn't in those depths. There's strange things, especially in the ocean. If you're looking at sea serpents, sea monsters, we don't know what's out there. And that could still be just a biological animal. If the Loch Ness monster isn't real, perhaps it is a giant eel or something else. It doesn't have to be necessarily what we pictured in our mind, like, oh, it's a dinosaur, it's a plesiosaur. Well, maybe there's a little more mundane explanation, but nonetheless, it's still something that we can explain in terms of, earthly science and animals. Lizard men, that's another topic that it starts to defy the bounds of, humanoid / reptilian. You can go into aliens, you can go into all that stuff. Who knows, really? Chupacabra, there's variations on what people say that is. That, most of these, as far as cryptids, I think if they exist, there can be a practical explanation that doesn't require UFOs and doesn't necessarily require interdimensional. And in terms of Bigfoot and all the portals and all that, it's hard for me to go back up that theory, because it just seems so logical that the sightings are always in places where these creatures would and could exist, in remote mountains, forests, swamps. There's not one popping out on my street in suburbia. If they're popping through portals, how does the portal know to go exactly where they should? It just almost seems like if that was the case, we'd be seeing stuff popping around.
That's a great point.
At least in terms of Bigfoot. So, but when you have these cases of cryptids that have gone back so many years, 50 years of research, 100 years, 200 or 300 years of sightings, that's why you start getting all these other theories, because people are just trying to explain how it is that credible people are seeing stuff, yet we don't have ultimate physical proof or a specimen. So I understand all the theories, but for me, I kind of stick with the more earthbound and down to earth theories.
Totally. And that's a great point about, the portals. Why aren't they like showing up at the supermarket? Now, so and this kind of goes off of this point, is that, they're found in sort of their kind of natural habitat. And a lot of them tend to sort of obviously keep to themselves. They're not, out there, being spotted everywhere. They're kind of in their natural habitat, and they tend to keep to themselves, but there are a few that are more aggressive. So, the Fouke monster is a good example of one that, attacked a family. And so you've studied cryptids for a while. Which ones of the accounts that you've heard, which sort of cryptid do you feel is maybe the most aggressive in terms of witness accounts? Would it be that the Fouke monster, or is there another one that's just as, has these kinds of stories of getting more involved in human activity?
The Fouke monster is a famous one because the Legend of Boggy Creek movie has kind of, painted the Southern Sasquatch as aggressive, and particularly in that case where there was several incidents, and especially one seminal incident with the Ford family where it was creeping up on the house and it was trying to get in, and it was, presumably aggressive. But if you start looking at the history of Bigfoot sightings, which I did in a book called Beyond Boggy Creek, I started to discover there's a lot of cases where they were shown to have aggression in, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Florida, all over. And you're like, wow, that it's not just confined to any one cryptid or one area. In the lizard man case, one of the most famous stories from back in 1988 in Bishopville, South Carolina, was that this creature had tried to attack a boy who had a flat tire in this spooky area, Skateboard Swamp. And those sensational ones are like, whoa, this creature is out to get you, But I think this kind of also just reinforces that they could be just natural animals, because you're going to have different individuals. And I mean, say, take a bear, for example. People, I've seen a bear in the wild several times. It didn't come after me. But then you read those stories, the shocking stories where somebody encountered a bear in the woods, and that particular bear was either having a bad day, or it thought you were trying to get at its young or whatever, and those people get attacked. So I almost think it's like that, where it's like no one cryptid is more aggressive than the other, but there is that potential, a Bigfoot, and even some of the lake monsters, Flathead Lake and other ones where there's these, hair-raising incidents where somebody seemed to get attacked. But then you have a bunch of just regular sightings where, I saw it go by, it walked off, it slithered, through the water or whatever. So I think it's just individual to the creature.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And if you had an unlimited budget and like any permit you needed, like if there was some sort of cryptid obsessed Tony Stark, right, that had a ton of money and he was looking to invest, how would you go about investigating or proving the existence of a cryptid? And this is sort of a multi-part question. One, it would be, which cryptid would you focus on? And then what would you do? What would it take? Where would you start, and sort of what would it take?
Yeah, that would be great. And I mean, I think anybody who's into cryptid research always dreams about some guy walking up and saying, I got $1 million. I'm going to send you out there. Let's try to prove this once for all. And you're like, yeah, game on, I think I would choose Bigfoot because I think that is the most probable of all of these. I mean, it's at the top of my list for, I really do think there's something behind the sightings. And, I'll probably go for the Pacific Northwest. I mean, I think I might just go for the granddaddy of all locations where Bigfoot is traditionally sighted. And I certainly believe that, if it does exist, that's got all the ingredients to hide a population of something that we can't necessarily prove. And so once you've established your area and the location, you kind of have to, I would assemble a team. You would need the classic, team of, you need somebody who's very good at tracking animal signs, that kind of thing. You would need somebody that's very good with technology, because there is a lot of technology we can use now, thermal cameras and imaging devices and things. Somebody that can keep track of that, recharge the batteries, do all that sort of thing. And then, somebody like me who, if we saw one, I wouldn't mind running after it just to make sure we can get the photo or do whatever. I'm not going to let that opportunity pass. So when, get a team and you would want to set up a base camp in an area where there's been sightings. Again, you go back to your research. What is the one area where there's been the longest history of sightings up until now? We have some really credible reports from within the last few years. That's the place to go, set up a base camp. And then if you had that operating capital where you could have, you know, somebody bring you supplies every so often, you know, you could just stay there, and then you can scout from there and just become one with the woods. And that's when you're really going to expose a creature who is a master of its own domain. You know, I mean, we're just the guests there in the woods. And if it wants to stay out of sight, people always underestimate the power and you know, the skill of animals. I mean, they're literally designed to be out of sight and to camouflage themselves. The coloration of the fur, their instincts, whether they move at night or during the day, all these things are designed for their own survival. So if we have a creature like Bigfoot, who we would presume to be more intelligent or more aware than these creatures, and possibly have the wherewithal to try to stay away from us, that's a hard thing to prove, because those things can just be there 1 second and just slip, just a turn, and you don't see them anymore. And people think, oh, they just disappeared. No. Animals, I mean, that's why tigers have their certain stripes. For a moment there, you can see them, and then they just drift into the foliage. So you would just need all that time on your side to be out there. And if you could find tracks and then kind of zero in on where the creatures are moving, that's when you may have a chance to set up that game camera or to get your own camera and to get the photo. But you're going to have to really work. And, you know, the reality is most of us, you know, you're out for a weekend, or maybe you get a week off, or you know, I'm going on an investigation, I have a week or two to mess around. It's just nothing. It's just enough to kind of get established and you get the stories and go into the woods. But it's not the same as, like you're saying, just that budget where you could really delve into it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like you have to do like I don't know if you watch The Curse of Oak Island, right? Where you just set up camp and then you just start bringing in people and bringing in what you need over the course of however long you need it until you come to some definitive resolution, which I don't know if you could ever, but at least you've given an incredible effort towards that. So right now I'd love to invite my co-hosts, Chris and Vic, to ask some questions. Chris, do you have any questions?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for coming on. And man, it's been a lot of fun hearing what you have to say. And especially after watching The Beast of Boggy Creek, I really enjoyed it, really engaging. I highly recommend it to anybody out there who's into this stuff. It is a great film. And I was really fascinated by the fact that you had a couple of people who had, the one gentleman in particular who had never shared his story with anyone. That was really wild that he came out and did it in that film. That was like a really cool part of the film. And the other thing I was hoping maybe you could kind of take us a little further into, because I don't think people fully realize, and I've been down in that area a little bit, but man, and it starts to come through in this film, but when you are in those bogs, those channels in like those wetlands in like Florida and Louisiana and down in those types of areas, I don't think people realize how freaky and haunting those types of areas are. And maybe you could just kind of take us there a little bit and to give us your impression when you were sort of meandering around through there, because it starts to come through, but I know firsthand, it is way eerier. And when you're there, it's way more visceral and you can really imagine that these things are lurking around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one thing that I've been fortunate to have been able to do, is go into these areas and just immerse myself in these bayous, bogs, Boggy Creek, you know, from all throughout the South. And in particular from you're talking about the Boggy Creek Monster documentary, right?
Yeah.
Terry Sutton was the guy you're talking about that had never shared the story. And that's one of the ones that's at the top of my list. And another one I would probably share with somebody to try to say, this is just an everyday guy, your guy next door. He happened to live out here and grew up in this area near Boggy Creek, and he had a sighting of something within 60 feet of him walking up over the ridge. I've gotten to know his family, and absolutely 100% credible. I can't prove what he saw, neither can he, but I can say he definitely saw something. And in the area where he saw that is in proximity to Boggy Creek, the Sulphur River, and the Mercer Bayou bottoms, which until you go into a place like that, you just can't appreciate the remoteness and just how rugged it is, and how easily something could just live back there and just stay out of sight. In particular, the Boggy Creek area, there's 18,000 miles of wetlands there in the Sulphur River bottoms that are virtually undeveloped. And so from the sightings that were back in the 1960s and 70s to now, it's been encroached on, but still a lot of that's been preserved, which would be the habitat. And if you look at that with a aerial view, you can see just trees after trees, and you get down in there and suddenly you're under the canopy of these cypress trees, and it has the Spanish moss hanging down. I mean, this is straight out of what you see on every Scooby-Doo cartoon, like when they try to picture the spookiest place next to the haunted house, it's that. And I've spent nights down there myself and one other guy or whatever. We paddled up those bayous at night, and you hear so many strange noises coming out of there. On one occasion we heard a howl, which we never could explain, but it could very well have been the Fouke monster. And when you're there, you're like, oh yeah, this is cool. But when it's 2 a.m. and you're out there by yourself in a canoe, and I mean, alligators are swimming right by you, and you hear a howl or something else, that's the moment you realize we can just disappear out here. Something could get us, and people, we would be on Investigation Discovery Channel of somebody trying to unravel what happened, if we were ever even found. It gives you that respect of the beauty of the nature, and also that haunting, eerie aspect of these locations. Even just deep woods, even some of the places I've been that aren't necessarily swampy, when you get out there at night and the miles and miles of trees, and you realize the isolation. There's one location where in the Ouachita Mountains where once you leave the blacktop, you got to drive about an hour and a half up into those mountains and hills before you're at base camp. You're that far in there. And then out there at night, when you hear stuff up on these ridges and you hear howls, and some hunters have told you they saw a Sasquatch, yeah, it's spooky. But those are the moments where you feel like at any moment you could see something. And I felt like that many times. Just right here, dude, it's going to happen. Something's going to walk by here and I'm going to see it. And at least I'm there to hopefully see it.
Awesome. That gave me the chills. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Vic, do you have a question?
Yeah, I got it. It sounds like when you visit these towns and you're investigating a cryptid, you get some people who are cooperative, but then you probably have some people who are very reluctant. Is there a particular cryptid that people were very reluctant about? They just maybe even had to drop or couldn't really investigate too far because people were just so weird about it?
In each case, you always have those folks that don't want to talk, or somebody will tell you that, so-and-so saw it, but he doesn't want to talk to you. He's told a few people. Always the case. It seems to be sprinkled within all of them. There wasn't necessarily any one cryptid that people didn't want to talk about, but in all of the cases, there's always, that one that you're never going to get to this old guy. He's not going to tell you his story. Sometimes, and of course I understand it's their experience, and they don't a lot of times feel like they may be made fun of or something. So it's almost like in every cryptid case, you're going to find people who are just gung-ho to tell you about it because their experience, you can see it in their face. They had just a exhilarating, wow, I think I saw this, And then you have those people like, I know it's out there and I've seen it, but I don't want to say nothing, you know. And a lot of those people don't want people traipsing around on their lands, you know. They're private, and that happened in the whole Boggy Creek thing when the legend of Boggy Creek came out in the 70s and it was a giant sensation in the movie theaters. All of a sudden, that little town of 500 people had more people down there with 6-packs and shotguns trying to hunt the Fouke monster than lived in the whole entire town, trespassing, you know, breaking down fences, traipsing through the woods with shotguns. It became a big problem. So in some ways, people are, you know, right to maybe not say this is the place where you're going to see Bigfoot unless they just want a bunch of people down there. So that seems to be, in my experience, the way it is.
And a lot of the guests that we've had on, they've had their personal journey of going out and hunting for cryptids and whatnot. And a lot of them have very scary stories, like firsthand stuff that happened to them. What's the weirdest thing or scariest thing, or both, that you've come across personally?
There's been 3 occasions where I felt like I was close to a cryptid. I've never had a sighting where I would say, you know, definitely saw something. I think the scariest time was when we were on the Mercer Bayou area in Fouke, Arkansas, and we were, myself and my late research partner were paddling up the bayou, and we like to listen to the sounds. We'll move by water because we can move further, and you can just kind of, you know, it's a nice way to go, and you can get out sometimes and walk around. But we were way out there in the middle of nowhere, and we heard this howl. And it, you know, when you're paddling on those bayous at night, there's a lot of ambient noise. There's a lot of frogs, insects, you know, the sound of the paddle. You're going through duckweed in the canoe. A lot of noises. So when we first heard it, it was like you had to kind of stop. Like, what was that? Was that a coyote? And we're like, I don't think that was a coyote. Well, luckily it howled again. And at that point, we could tell it sounded big. It didn't sound like a bear. It didn't have that bear sound. It wasn't a cougar. And those are things that would be in there. I want to say it was ape-like or anything, but it just sounded big, and it wasn't a coyote. And well, it did it again after about a minute later. And so now we're just like, interest is peaked. The hair stands up on the back of your neck. And it was really kind of scary because you're like, okay, we're way out here in the middle of nowhere. What is that? Well, unfortunately, it didn't howl again. So we paddled around some more, and then we came on back to the camp eventually. When we got out, pulled the canoe up on this high bank and went up to where the tent was, all of a sudden, shortly thereafter, this howl came again, but this time it was down there just across the water where we had parked the canoe. And so the first realization was, did this thing hear us up there and follow us down the bayou channel? And is it now standing down there? Because it was really close. And that was just crazy. So he was trying to get the audio recorder, and I just grabbed a flashlight. I'm like, the hell with it. I ran down that hill with that light trying to see it. And I remember, you know, thinking, but not thinking clearly, other than here's my chance maybe to see this thing. Well, after that, whatever it was, it howled again, and then it took off. And the next howl was 50 or 75 yards away. It was just moved so fast, and then howled again. And now you hear the nervous coyotes yip in with it. But at that point, your adrenaline's going. You're sort of scared, but excited. And again, you're like, that's when it all comes home. It's like, man, if that was some big old 7-foot tall, hairy, bipedal, ape-like creature standing that close to our tents, you know, that's just spooky. And then of course, we had to sleep in those tents the rest of the night. So that was pretty scary. Pretty scary. And you know, but you know, at the end of the day, you're like, that's part of it. But unfortunately, I could never get it in that light. You know, it just, like an animal, it just took off.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
So your impetus to run towards the sound is unique. I don't think I would have the, the wherewithal to do that. I would hide in the tent or run the other way. So was that something that you just always had? You just always wanted to run towards it as opposed to run away from it?
I don't know. I mean, I just was my reaction in the moment, but I think that was based on, I don't know. It's like I'm spent so much time doing this, and I guess my thinking was, maybe I felt a little safer because it was maybe the bayou channel was between me and it, or I perceived it was. I mean, sounds are hard to localize, but I don't know. I just like, I don't want to miss that opportunity. So, I mean, I've heard these stories where people go out and, man, we're going to hunt this thing. And we heard a noise and we ran. It's like, what are you running from? I mean, and that's, and if I had gotten injured, as long as I didn't get killed, I'm like, this will make a great story, as well. My research partner, I did a lot of research with, Tom Shirley. He's since died of cancer, but this guy also, he was fearless. And so, that was always our thinking. We just didn't care. Like, now alligators or something, I wasn't, when I see them swimming by the canoe, I mean, I see them, my arms are kind of inside, or I'm, weary of that. But something I couldn't see, well, until I saw it, I didn't want to make a judgment as to whether I should run. Now, if I got over there and the light get on it, it was this big old thing, maybe then I would turn around and run. And there's literally a story from literally that very spot back in 2000, where there was some coon hunters down in Mercer Bayou, and they were hunting at night, and there was a group of, I don't know, 3 or 4, and this one individual went off in another direction. His dogs, he had world-class coon hounds. They went off and they were howling as if they had treed a raccoon. So he followed up and went up there, and they suddenly kind of became nervous, and he was trying to figure out what was going on. They weren't howling up a tree or barking at a coon. And he said in those moments he looked up, and it was moonlit out there. And this is again in the middle of this spooky swamp. And he's by himself, with maybe a headlamp, but it's dark in there. He looked up, and in the moonlight, he could see this big, huge ape-like creature just standing there looking at him. And at this point, the dogs, were brave at one moment, and then he said they just got behind my legs and just sat there whimpering. And he said the thing just kind of leered at him and reached down and scooped up water and splashed it at him, and then it just took off. He would never go back. He sold the hounds, got rid of his guns, and never went back down there. He freaked him out so much. And this is a coon hunter. So this is a place where, I think it's a credible sighting. This is that very place. So I just, in some ways I'm crazy, but I want to see that thing too. I don't know why. So that's why I ran toward it.
Wow, that's so cool. So now, I guess the question would be, what's next? What cryptid out there should be concerned because you are coming for it? What's the next one?
I don't know. I've got this big list of things I want to do and cases I want to research. And usually I look at it in terms of a book project, or, whether it's a documentary or something, because I like doing those projects, just like I did with Beast of Boggy Creek or Lizard Man or something. So I've just kind of been debating a few. I know the Dog Man is a popular one, and I've been getting more and more sightings of Dog Man. So I've thought about, is there something I could do with that? But I hadn't really decided. There's just so many of them. It's like, I think the more I go, the more I have a harder time choosing, like, what do I do next? Early on, I just fumbled around and it just went by instinct. Now I'm probably over analyzing.
Well, are there any that are any creatures abroad that you'd want to investigate? So not, you've spent kind of most of the time here. Is there anything that you would go somewhere and take a look at?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and if I could, or I had the budget or the wherewithal, which I've kind of looked into, would be to Lake Pendik from Sumatra. And Sumatra is one of the Indonesian islands, South Asia. And there is a long history of a more diminutive, a smaller Bigfoot-like creature called the orang pendek that exists on the island of Sumatra. And there's been quite a number of credible sightings, including wildlife photographers and some tiger conservationists and things like that, as well as footprints found and investigations by some of my colleagues that have gone over to Sumatra. So I really think there's a lot of credibility in that case and in those sightings. But of course, when you're talking about an international thing like that and going to a country where you don't have a television crew or something else footing the budget, you've got to do it yourself. And obviously with today and travel and all this stuff going on, it's become increasingly difficult. But the orang pendek is kind of my dream case. If I could go, it's kind of at the top of my list. And the only reason I haven't literally done it is because of the, logistics and doing international cases.
Have you ever, one of the things that the book series that I do is a lot of it takes place in our national parks. And so there's always certain national parks that are featured. One, I would be curious as to maybe what your favorite national park is. And two, are there any creatures that you've investigated that sort of took you into a national park because that's where the sightings were?
I like the Smoky Mountain Park. I just always thought it was beautiful up there. I went up there as a kid, and then in recent years have looked into some of the alleged Bigfoot or Tennessee wildman cases up there. So that's always been appealing to me. In terms of what's in my books, I once went to the Ocala National Forest, which is in Florida. That's kind of central Florida. Long history of skunk ape sightings in that area. And it's just a really cool place. It's one of those that reminds me, like, you might see a dinosaur or something. It's got the dwarf palmetto trees. A storm rolls in. There's drizzle coming down off the leaves. And, I was there and even possibly there was a large animal, maybe a skunk ape, just out of sight up there as well. I was there in January and there was literally nobody up there. So, those are the places where, you've got some walking paths and all that, and you see that and you're like, people come up here to hike and stuff. That's nice, bring their families. And I'm over there in the dark, going off the path, and creeping around in the woods and looking for footprints or whatever. So yeah, you kind of get a vacation and a mysterious investigation all in one.
Yeah, totally. Now I'm going to do a sort of major pivot to talk to you about Ghoultown. So I mentioned in the bio when I was talking about you, about your, about Ghoultown and that you're a musician. Can you tell us sort of what was the genesis of that? So you had always been a musician, but how did you come to Ghoultown? Like, where did that come from?
Yeah, so I started my music career when I was in 7th grade and joined a band. And then in high school, I was playing in punk bands back when I was small, and got on a vinyl record at the time, one song on a compilation. And then after high school and then during my college times, I joined a band that was called Solitude, and we were signed on Roadrunner Records. And that was a pretty good deal. We got to tour a lot, Europe and Canada and US. And and that was a doom metal, kind of heavy metal band. And so it's kind of into punk and metal. And my favorite band is the Misfits. Always loved the monster thing, of course, anything with like monster overtones. And I just always wanted to start something that I thought was unique, that was my own style, not necessarily any other thing. And I grew up in Texas, even though I like punk and metal, but I grew up my parents listened to classic country, and I love spaghetti Western movies and all that stuff. So I just kind of put all that in a blender and came up with this band idea, Ghoul Town. I just thought up the band would be cool, like this dark cowboy kind of thing that played a mixture of like Johnny Cash meets Rob Zombie, or somewhere in between. Ghost Riders in the Sky come to life. And that was the vision for it. And I started the band, started in 1999, and we quickly got on some compilations. We went and did some tours, played CBGBs in New York, and kind of got a little quick following. And I liked doing it. And I also that was when the internet was first starting to come out, and I was dissatisfied with record labels. Even though they could put us on tour and stuff, I never saw any money from it. And so I thought, I'm going to do this like indie style, independent, and I did that with Ghoul Town. And over the years, it just became bigger and bigger. We're not the biggest band in the world, but we don't have to be, because we own everything. And then, of course, that paid off as streaming and all this other stuff came into fashion, where indie artists are all over the place. And we have this, catalog of albums. So that's in between that. I would write for rock magazines, and I wrote for Rue Morgue, the horror magazine that you can buy in stores and whatever.
Now, Curse of El Dorado came out in 2020.
Right.
And obviously the pandemic threw a wrench in the works in terms of touring. What's on the horizon tour wise?
Yeah, we didn't get to play much, last year. And, when the lockdown happened, we just happened to be literally scheduled to go in and record the album. So we spent our lockdowns, kind of doing that. I don't know, touring has become hard because I'm so busy with everything now. It's just become it's just a juggling match of everything. And the band, over the years, we've toured less just because it's, I don't know, we got things going on, and the world seems to be against us now with just shutting down everything as far as venues and making it even harder than it was. So I really don't know how much touring we'll do with this. Kind of depends on if I think up a book or if I want to do that. It's almost to the point I'll flip a coin to see what to do, because I love doing it all, but at some point, I also got to make a living at it. So, I mean, it's, again, cryptozoology, until I get that benefactor that's going to throw the $1 million at me, it is a job, all of it. So I got to be observant to, if I'm going to do Ghoul Town and I'm going to do both, is try to make a living so I don't have to get a real job, because I certainly don't want that.
How can people, follow you, see you, or, their appearances coming up? Where can they go? What can they do to follow Lyle Blackburn?
Well, you can drop by my site at lyleblackburn.com, and that's got links to where my books can be bought. Obviously, all of them are on Amazon and paperback, Kindle, and hardback in some cases. And my website has links to Ghoul Town for the music. You can buy Ghoul Town at wherever finer music is sold, iTunes and Bandcamp and wherever, Amazon. I've got just a list of dates on my lyleblackburn.com site where, I've got Ohio Bigfoot Conference coming up. There's a Fouke Monster Festival this summer. There's more things that are opening up. Last year, a lot of events got shut down. So it seems like it's getting a little bit back to where we're able to have some get-togethers, and, people can get together and talk about cryptids, or I do horror conventions as well sometimes, and then Ghoul Town gigs. So yeah, just hit up the site, and you can find information that you need there.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it. It was an incredible treat for us to have you on. I'm super excited to get the chance to talk to you. And thank you for telling us about, cryptid hunting, about, all of that, the aspects of it that come up in your experience. This was an incredible episode. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And I was kind of looking into your book. So a lot of this is two-way where I can discover something. I'm like, this is very cool. So appreciate you guys having me on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank you so much. Great meeting you.
So that was Lyle Blackburn. You can go visit him at lyleblackburn.com. So guys, any final words?
Well, I tell you, what an amazing guest. And it was so fun to see it come full circle, after seeing his film and the books and listening to his music and then getting to meet him in person. Wow, what a treat.
Vic?
Yeah, he's such a cool guy, and I like his methodical, just real based approach and the way he thinks about these cryptids and his thoughts on, portals versus these things being a little bit more practical, but just hidden amongst us in the woods. He thinks like I do in many ways, and it was a real treat to talk to him.
That was a fascinating discussion. I loved having Lyle on to talk to him about his experiences, which are just incredible. And, I encourage everyone to go to his website, lyleblackburn.com, to learn more about him and learn more about what he does and pick up one of his books. He's got the most recent one, the Boggy Creek Case Book, as well as a bunch of other books about these cryptids. And his research is extensive. I mean, he goes to these places, he really investigates this stuff, and he gets witness accounts that no one else gets. So it's pretty extraordinary. You can also check out the documentaries that he's involved in. It's all great stuff. So it was an incredible show. I want to thank you all for joining us for this episode of The Creature Files. We invite you to go to the website at mythicalwildlife.com for more information. You can also report a sighting and maybe even wind up on the show. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/mythicalwildlife. You can also find out more information about the books on the website. So you have Guardians of the Griffin's Claw, Silky of San Francisco, and the latest book, Search for the Swan Maiden. So you can find all that information out on the website. And if you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead and click subscribe so you always get the latest episode of The Creature Files. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And until next time, always remember to heed your call to
adventure.
The Creature Files. It might just save your life.